All right, so we'll say good evening. Good evening. Let's begin. So the truth is, we have to first start. We didn't finish off the Mar Makomos from last week. So what I just did is, for those who weren't here last week, I just reposted last week's Mar Makomos in the chat, so you can follow along. We left off at source 19. Last week, actually, a really interesting topic. So we find ourselves, and tonight, Mirat Hashem, our intended goal is to Mirat Hashem finish the Malacha of Choreish. That's what we're setting out to do. So let's begin. So in number 19, the Shulchan says as follows. Again, so what you have in front of you tonight is Chelik Beis, part 2. We're just finishing off part 1. Again, there are no extra copies of part 1, but it's in the chat. So source 19. Ein socha kim be'egozim. V'lo be'ptapuchim ukiyotze bohem mishum ashviyei gumos. So Shulchan brings down an interesting halacha. You can't play with nuts, he says, either with nuts or with apples. Now, just what he's referring to over here is they're playing with nuts on the ground. On the ground, it's like, I don't know, rolling nuts, pitching, I don't know, whatever it is, whatever the game exactly was. But Lamaisa, it required the rolling of nuts or the rolling of apples on the ground. So the Shulchan Aruch says you're not allowed to do this on Shabbos. Why? Mishum ashuyei gumos, out of a concern, because remember again, anything that deals directly with the ground, there's a fundamental concern that one may come to go out and level out the ground. A little chazar from last week. Remember, Chaburah, what's the malach involved with leveling out the ground? It depends. What does it depend on? Where you're doing it, right? Remember again, outdoors, it's an issue of choreish. Indoors, ultimately, it's a potential issue of binyan. So here again, the Shulchan Aruch says that Allah Lamai. So you can't go out and play this game on the ground out of a concern that you may come to level out the ground. So again, if you do that in your home, that's a potential issue of bona. If you do it outside, that's a potential issue of choreish. V'dafka agabe karka. Here it is. But this is dafka on the ground. Aval agabe shulchan shari. But ultimately, again, if you're playing, let's say, the game on a table, it's not a problem. Because obviously, again, the only time you have to get concerned with the possibility, even a gzera derabanan, of leveling out the ground, is that's when you're on the ground. But if you're playing the same game, ultimately, again, on a table, it's not the problem. Good. So we can skip the rest of the Shulchan Aruch for now. So let's say, so where does this have a fundamental, like, practical application? So I'll say, so for example, what this would mean on a most basic level is that halacha l'maisa, you're not allowed to play soccer on Shabbos, right? So again, leaving aside the other potential issue, I'm leaving aside the issue of ball playing on Shabbos, as whether or not ball playing itself is permitted on Shabbos. Is it permitted? Is it uvda d'chol? We'll leave that on the side for now. Let's assume for a moment that technically playing ball is permitted. But again, what we see over here is that ball playing, which requires the constant use or rolling of something over the ground, is going to be fundamentally prohibited lest you come to level out the area. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa. So therefore, soccer is going to be prohibited. The poskim bring down that along these same lines, basketball will be prohibited. Now, the interesting part, what's the chap with basketball? The chap is that any sport which actively requires the object that the sport is used for being used on the ground. So in the case of a basketball, it's being dribbled on the ground, will run into this issue of the Shulchan Aruch, of the concern of leveling out of the ground to make it flat. So I will say, so this is really quite, or for that matter, again, what else does it include? It could include kids sitting on the ground and playing a game of Gaga. It's the same idea. Anything that ultimately, again, involves a ball or some other type of sporting item and constant and consistent use on the ground is going to be prohibited. Al tashui gumos. Yeah?
Why is playing basketball any different than playing nuts or apples on the table?
I'm sorry?
Basketball is usually not played.
Oh, what's up? Chaim, I'm in the first source, man. Give me like 2 minutes to get into this. Good. Let's play it through. Seriously? Pretend it's Michas Chavra, right? Just pretend it's Michas Chavra. No, good. So the reason I say basketball is because, again, remember, basketball, technically speaking, could be something that a person is not necessarily playing on a hard court. You're asking, but what about something that a person normally plays on a hard court? People also play soccer, on a soccer. So we'll get to all of that. My point just is over here that any sport that could potentially be involved ultimately, again, with the ground would be asra al tashviye gumo. So take a look at number 20. So the Sefer Shisha Shabbos writes as follows. He says, Aval agabe karka mirut sefes. Chaim, here's your point. But again, if you're playing on a solid court, on a solid ground, the lo shayach ashvuye gumos, Gam kein aser, the karka bekarka michlif. Shabbos, this is interesting. The Sefer Shvisas Shabbos holds that unlike sweeping, right? Again, remember, let's go back for a second. That unlike sweeping, where we made this distinction that, well, actually, leave out sweeping for just a moment. Shvisas Shabbos says that even if you're playing the sport on a hard court, ultimately it's still going to be aser. Why? Because we're concerned that lamaisa, one may confuse one type of ground with another type of ground. That if we allow you to play it on a hard surface, you may think that you're able to play it on a regular surface as well. The gazrinan atu karka merutzaf, v'hacha lo mahani mashebatea ir merutzafin shederech lischok bechutzos ubirachovos. So this is actually very interesting. So the Shvisas Shabbos brings down. He says that unlike sweeping, where we made this distinction, where halacha lamaisa again, if the majority of homes in the city were, let's say, hard floors, that we said that halacha lamaisa, there's no need to be gozer. In this case, it's going to be different. Why? Because in this case, the derech of these types of sports ultimately is to play it on an unpaved surface. Now, to Chaim's point, you're right. So this wouldn't necessarily include basketball, but certainly would include soccer or any other game that by definition is usually played on, we'll call it an earthen surface. So this is very interesting over here. So what you see the Shvisas Shabbos says explicitly is that unlike by sweeping, where we say that halacha l'maisa, the majority of the floors in the home, in the city are tiled floors, so then essentially the gzera kind of disappears on a tiled floor, on a hard floor. By sports, that's not going to be the case. By sports, even if for argument's sake, so in other words, let's say for argument's sake, you could say that the majority of soccer courts in the city are hard floors, halacha l'maisa Shvisas Shabbos would still say it's still aser. It's still aser. Why? Because the nature of the sport is to play it ultimately, again, on an earthen surface. Okay? Aruch HaShulchan in number 21 says the following. He writes over here, he quotes over here the whole halacha. If you take a look towards the end of it, he says as follows. He says, I'm sorry, actually, let's read the whole thing, because Shulchan Aruch adds in a couple of interesting nuances. Aruch HaShulchan writes, 21. Ein sochakim be'egozim al gavi karka v'lo b'tabuchim gzer shami avo lahashvos gumos v'yechayiv mishum bona babayis or mishum choresh basada. So that's everything we saw before, right? You can't go ahead and play a game on the earthen surface lest you come to level out the ground. And again, in the house it's bona, outside ultimately it's choresh. He goes on, he says, v'asr lischok b'chomine peros mitamzeh aval agabi shulchan o b'bayis sheyesh bo ritzba mutter. So here, interesting enough, the Aruch HaShulchan says that you're allowed to play these games. Look what he adds in over here. He says you could play it ultimately again on the table or on a home that has a solid floor. So you notice how the Aruch HaShulchan adds that in? He says, Debazel lo shayach hashviyeh gumos, because again, obviously, if you're playing on a table or you're playing on a hard surface, a hard floor, there's no concern that you're going to come to straighten out the ground. V'lo gazru atu shachok agabe karka. And he says, there's no concern that if we let you play a sport on a hard floor, that you'll come to play it on an earthen floor. Now, why not? So I just want to point out what's happened to you over here. So in number 20, the Sefer Shvisas Shabbos brings down that we are concerned that if we let you play soccer on a solid court, on a solid floor, you'll come to play it on an earthen floor. Because that's the derech to play that type of sport on an earthen floor. The Aruch HaShulchan says, we're not concerned about that. Why are we not concerned? Look at the last line, 21, last phrase. Dischok eino davar shel kvius sheyigziro ze mipnei ze. Shabbos said, this is fascinating. The Aruch HaShulchan says the only time that Chazal made a gzira was for something that was considered to be what he calls a kavua activity. An activity that happens on a regular basis. But activity that doesn't happen on a regular basis, that doesn't have a kvius, Chazal weren't gozer. So we'll say, so watch this. This is fascinating. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa. Let's go back to last week's shir. So remember again, sweeping. So therefore, in a case of sweeping, ultimately, Chazal said that even if you have a hard floor, you still can't sweep your floor. Why? Why not? What? Gezerah, you may come to sweep the earthen floor. Okay, so we saw the Ber Halacha that says if the majority of floors in the city are hard floors, fine, leave them on the side. But why is there such a gezerah like that, says Aruch HaShulchan? Because again, at the end of the day, that's a kavua activity. From the Aruch HaShulchan's perspective, it's interesting. He holds that the playing of sports is not a kavua activity. He holds in that. Now, again, we'll say, what does that mean? That people don't play sports on a regular basis? No, that's not what he means. He says there's a chilik between what we'll call activities of daily living versus activities that occur with, let's say, a frequency, but lav dafka, their daily activities. So therefore, he holds that halacha l'maaseh, the act of playing sports, is not one of activities of daily living. Therefore, it doesn't fall under the umbrella of the gzeira. And therefore, again, remember the gzeira being, you can't do something even on a hard floor, lest you come to do it on an earthen floor. So therefore, the Aruch HaShulchan says, everyone will agree, you can't play soccer, you can't play with the nuts, you can't play with the apples on an earthen floor, right? Everyone will agree with that. But whereas the Shulchan Aruch and the Shisas Shabbos seem to indicate that halacha l'maisa, even if you have a hard floor, you still can't. Al gzeira, that you may come to do it on an earthen floor. The Aruch HaShulchan does not hold of that gzeira. Therefore, the Aruch HaShulchan went paskin that you could play with the nuts, the apples, soccer, as long as you have a hard floor. And we're not concerned that you may come to confuse this halacha with an earthen floor. Why? Because this is not considered to be a kavua, right, established or activities of daily living. Fascinating halacha. If you take a look at number 22, in the Sefer Nishmas Shabbos, he writes as follows. He says, "The ba'ayoros gedolos shekemat kol hamakom shemibachutz hin mechusim beritzbas havanim o bebiton shelo mibayed besoch habayis mutar l'sachek ela af b'chutz b'mekomos hamitzurafin mutarin. The dino besoch habayis delo gazrinon kisoch habayis lo gazrinon merutzaf atu in merutzaf." See here again, the Nishmas Shabbos just happens to write that if you live in a place where, let's say, the majority of areas are paved, and even the majority of surfaces upon which sports are played are paved. This goes to Chaim's point, right? If the majority are paved, then halacha l'maaseh he holds, then there would not be a gzeira, and one would be permitted to go ahead and play these sports on Shabbos as well. So both say, what comes out, interestingly enough, is really two different schools of thought. On one hand, we have the Shulchan Aruch. Right, we have the Shulchan Aruch. Now, the Shulchan Aruch himself, his own position is not abundantly clear. All the Shulchan Aruch tells us is that halacha l'maaseh, you can't play these games on an earthen floor. That's what he says, right? And why? I concern you might level the floor. Then the Ramah comes along and says that ultimately it's only on the floor, but you can play it on the table. Okay. Shvisas Shabbos comes along, which is again is a contemporary sefer. But Shvisas Shabbos comes along and says you can't even play those sports on a hard floor. Why? Atu, that you may come to, lest you come to go and play it on an earthen floor. An earthen floor. Okay, and at the end of the day, he says, but what about the fact if the majority of floors are paved? He says, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the derech to play these sports is on an earthen floor. Aruch HaShulchan, the whole conversation doesn't get started because the gzero is never made for sports. The gzero is only made for things that are activities of daily living. So if we allow you to go ahead and sweep your hard floor, you may come to go ahead and sweep your earthen floor. But for sports, which is not considered to be activities of daily living, says Aruch HaShulchan, there's no gzera. Therefore, halacha l'maaseh, you could play it on a hard surface. Nishmas Avram takes it a step further. That halacha l'maaseh, if the majority of spaces are paved, ultimately no problem playing these sports on Shabbos. So what is the bottom line? With this, like I said, we're not getting into, in general, the issue of ball playing on Shabbos as to whether or not it is the ideal Shabbos activity. Let's presuppose that it's not the ideal Shabbos activity. But again, kids are kids, and this is certainly not the sort to fall on and not the battle to wage, in the chinuch of our children. That's absolutely for sure, right? But lamaisa, so what should you do? So let's start with the easy stuff. So obviously, soccer is going to be usher. Soccer on your front lawn, right? Soccer in your backyard. That is.
Isn't that by dirt? When we say earthen floor, isn't that talking about dirt?
But there's grass.
What about grass?
No, it's grass. It's
grass.
any time. No, grass is the same. Earthen doesn't mean dirt or mud. It means earth. It means the ground. It means the ground. I'm sorry?
It's something that's not paved.
Correct. It's anything. So whatever we're talking, when we say earthen is grass, earthen is everything. So let's go with what is clearly going to be usher. So a game of soccer on the grass is absolutely going to be unequivocally usher. Now again, I will point out, you run the risk of it actually being potentially, it's not going to be like a real Issa D'Oraisa, because again, even if people are kicking up grass, it's Melachos and Tzricha, it's going to be, but Lamaisa, it's usher, at least midrabanan. Right? The question becomes, so we'll say, let's go with what's mutter, what's unequivocally mutter, right? Kids playing ball, kicking around a soccer ball in the basement. I don't mean that like it's mutter, like because you allow that in your house. I mean that like technically from Hilchos Shabbos perspective, on a carpeted area, everyone's going to agree that's the same thing like the shulchan. Same like the shulchan. So the question will be in a hard court. Right, let's say again, kids they have access to a gym and they want to kick around the soccer ball right inside. So what's going to be the halacha over there? So that's going to be machlokas. Shvisa Shabbos ultimately again would still say that is aser, but the Aruch HaShulchan and the Nishma Shabbos would ultimately both say that it's mutter. Okay. I'm sorry.
Just walking.
Oh, so now we come to Chelik Beis. So let's begin tonight's Marmakomos.
You're going to drop the grass. You're going to knock out the grass.
Right, it's different malachas. That's what I'm saying. There are other associated malachas over here of kotzer, oked davar mimakom gidulo. Correct, but that's a different malacha. We want to just stay focused on the choreish pieces of it.
Why is it inside a gym or a house?
I'm sorry.
Why is there a chiluk of soccer?
It's not the chiluk. Actually, I'm sorry. Let me explain it better. The chiluk is not between a gym and a house. The chiluk is actually between carpeting and solid floor. It's interesting that the post can bring down that a carpeted area. I didn't put this on the sheet, but this is also the same Shvisas Shabbos that ultimately, again, the post can bring down that a carpeted area has the din of a covered area, and a covered area has the din of a shulchan, which is interesting, right? That it's, in other words, a carpeted area is considered to be fundamentally removed, almost like from the din of karka. And therefore again falls into the shulchan category. All right, yeah, interesting. All right, well, say so good. So that's by ball playing, and again, that's good. So now we at least know what's unequivocally aser, and again we know that kind of outside of playing soccer on the grass, you have different shades. Fundamental machlokas. Good. So also with that, let's begin the second set of marmakomos. So now. In the other piece of Choreish is the act of making a furrow. And this, again, number one, so this is the Hakdama, this is the introduction that the Chaburah brings down, that we saw actually in last week's shir. I underlined the line, he says, Osha asa charetz. So remember again, we've kind of been focused in last week's shir much more on the concept of hashva'as gumos, of leveling out the ground. Now what the Chaburah is bringing down over here is that also the concept of Choreish also is shiasa charetz, making a hole or a depression. So literally again, person goes in and sticks their finger into the ground, makes a hole into the ground. Technically speaking, that's Choreish. So here's what's interesting. Take a look at number 2. So the Gemara Maseches Be'ah says as follows. Now, both say the topic over here is actually a little bit different. We're going to touch on it. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Eina kol migram b'Shabbos chutz min ha'agala mipnei shekoveshes. So Rabbi Yehuda says, generally you can't drag things on dirt on Shabbos. Because the act of dragging, we're going to get more into this in just a moment, the act of dragging something on the dirt, ultimately, again, could create an issue of charishi, make a furrow. But ultimately, Rabbi Huda says, except a wagon, an agala. Why? Because a wagon, when it goes over dirt, she koveshes. And I will say, koveshes, we're going to see, the Gemara says, Mesha koveshes, inaval charetz lo avda. So the Gemara, it's a kasha, but it actually turns out to be a statement. That interestingly enough, the wagon doesn't make a charetz, but rather it does what's called koveshes. What's the definition of koveshes? Rashi says in number 3, Mesha koveshes, Rashi says, charetz hanir behilucha, lo ayedei chafiru ela koveshes vidoreses hakarka, v'nidush tachta v'nasem mikoma nomoch. Aval eno zaz afra mimkoma. Essentially, I will say, koveshes means to compress the earth. So here the Gemara makes this interesting distinction between charetz, which means making a furrow, which essentially means displacing earth that was in one place and I actively moved it somewhere else, versus compressing the earth. Now, compressing also still displaces, but Lamaisa, you can see the visual difference, right? One is pressing down on the earth, one is digging into the earth. So the Gemara wants to suggest over here that the din of Choreish is dafka a din ultimately of a charetz, of making a furrow. But if you're just kovesh, if you just compress the earth, then ultimately, again, that is not the malacha. Now, you're going to see where this comes up in just a little bit. Let's take a look at the Shulchan Aruch number 4. So Shulchan Aruch writes as follows. Davar she'en miskayim. I will say, the truth is, we're going to see over here that actually this is going to be some really fascinating lumdus that we're going to do over here. So let's begin this. So the Shulchan Aruch writes as follows. It says, Davar she'en miskayim. I will say, what's the definition of Davar she'en miskayim? Davar she'en miskayim means I perform an act, and the act results in a malacha. but I did not have in mind for that malacha to occur. Let's go davar she'eino miskaven. So therefore, Shlomo writes, davar she'eino miskaven mutter. So in general, if you do an act, and the act inadvertently results in a malacha, but you did not intend, you did not want the malacha to occur, ultimately, again, that is mutter. So what's a good example of this? He says, gives one qualification. V'hu shelo yehei psik reisha. We spoke about this a little bit last week. That's assuming that what? That the action is not a psik reisha. What's a psik reisha? A psik reisha is also unintended. It's also unintended. So if psik reisha is unintended, where lies the difference in a psik reisha davar she'eino miskaven? A psik reisha is unintended, but unavoidable. Unavoidable. Right? It is definitely going to happen versus a davar she'eino miskaven, which is unintended and avoidable. And avoidable. So the Gemara says, listen, so Shulchan says like this, a davar she'eino miskaven is mutter. So if I'm going to do something that results in a malacha, but that is not my intention. That is not my intention. The act is mutter, as long as the malacha result is avoidable. But if the malacha result is unavoidable, then l'maisa, that's called a psik reisha, and it's going to be aser. So for example, Hilchos, this is a classic case. Hilchos, gorer adam mita kiseh v'safsol, ben gidolim ben gitanim, o bilvad shelo yiskaven lasas charetz. Therefore, we'll say on Shabbos, right? I want to drag a chair. I'm sitting in my backyard. I want to drag a chair across my backyard. The halacha is, I'm allowed to do it. I'm allowed to do it. As long as what? As long as I don't have intention to make a furrow. Now, it's a little bit more than that. It's as long as I don't have intention, and what? And what? And it is avoidable. In other words, and it's possible to drag the chair from point A to point B without making a furrow. So as long as it's possible to do so, I'm allowed to drag the chair from point A to point B. What happens if the furrow happens? If it happens, it's okay. It's a davar she'eino miskaven, as long as it was technically avoidable. If it was unavoidable, then it becomes what? Psik reisha. And psik reisha is aser. Okay, now watch this. Now it's interesting. The Shulchan Aruch says you could do this with a big chair, with a little chair. Mishnah number 5 comments. He says, "Bein gedolim, dimitrach leili samak seifa." So again, I will say. So now the Mishnah deals with, well, why is someone dragging a chair to begin with? He says, why? Because it's a tircha. Right? It's a tircha to go ahead, right? It's a krich, as they say, right? It's just annoying to carry it on my shoulder. So both say, it is mutter to drag the chair. But it may result in a furrow. It's okay. So davar she'eino miskaven, that's not your intention. That's not your intention. The Kasa Magen Avraham, listen to this, and I'll say, this is incredible. Magen Avraham writes, the gidolim biyoser, a very large item, Osr ligra ala aretz psik reishahu tebevadai yaaseh charetz. So we'll say, so okay, Magen Avraham says, go on a second. Listen, if you have a very big chair, let's say a very heavy item, where you know if you drag it, it's going to create a furrow, then what? What's the halacha? Can't drag it. Why not? Why not? Psik reisha. Okay, that's obvious. Here's the kunz. Watch this. Get ready for this. And last line, number 5. Vafilu merutzav bekarko shel shayish osr ligrar tigazrinon merutzav. Wow. I will say, look now watch this. The Magen Avraham says, by the way, a very large chair, you can't even drag it across your living room. But let's say I have marble floors. Right? So nothing's going to happen on those floors. The Magen Avraham says, if this is the kind of chair that's big enough, that were you to drag it outside, it would absolutely make a furrow. So in other words, there would be a psik reisha on the outside. You can't move it, you can't drag it on the inside either. What are we concerned about? We're concerned ultimately, again, that halacha l'maisa, you may come to get confused and think if it's mutter in the house, it's mutter out of the house. So I just want to point out, pause for just a second. You know what this is according to the Magen Avraham? You know what happens? Let's say you're having a lot of company for Shabbos lunch, and let's say it happens to be the configuration of your home. It's like you have a home, I don't know what they call the layout, but like where your living room and dining room are like one area. So you have a great chap. What do you want to do? You want to move around some furniture. So again, it's common. What do you do with the couch? You just push the couch. According to the Magen Avraham, you would not be allowed to do that on Shabbos. Right? Why? It's interesting. Not because of like uvda dechol, tircha yisera, we learn these things in smichas chaver, right? Why wouldn't you be allowed to do it? It's incredible. You can't do it. Why? Choreish. It's incredible, right? Because the Magen Avraham says we wouldn't allow you to do that because, again, remember, you couldn't do that outside, right? You couldn't do that outside because outside this would be a psik reisha piece of furniture. And the Magen Avraham says whatever is a psik reisha outside, okay, we're say incredible, right? This is my B'chol Shabbos that people. Okay, we're going to get to everything. We're going to get to everything, right? So my B'chol Shabbos that people go ahead and move around furniture. The Magen Avraham says if you can't move it outside because it's psik reisha, you can't move it inside either. Pretty dramatic position. The Gazvinon, and the number 5, the Gazvinon, merutzav after ein merutzav, because we're concerned that if you're allowed to do it inside, even though again the inside floor is a hard floor, and therefore there's no furrow issue. We're concerned, let you do it inside, you may come do it outside. And both say, now watch this. Look at number 6, the Sharat Tzion. So both say, this is a great piece of lumdus that actually is going to inform a number of fascinating Lamaisa cases. So take a look. So source number 6. By the letter Beis. You see it, I apologize. I know it's a little bit grainy. He writes over as follows. He says, Mistabra. Here we go. Dim kol b'nei ha'ir, dim kol ha'ir, merutzaf ba'avanim o bekrashim, yesh lahakil bazeh. So again, interesting that the Sharat Tzion says that if you live in a place where the majority of areas are paved areas, then you don't have to worry about this halacha. Right? You don't have to worry about this halacha. Right? So he says, va'afilu im nachmir, Lekamon b'kibud. Yeah, somebody must hear that. No? Okay, good. All right, good. Some of them go undetected, but that's mamish. Okay, so good. Someone says, Hacha, listen to this. We'll say, so now, listen to this halacha. So we'll say, so now watch this. This is absolutely fascinating. So now, he says, if now, his Lashon Hara is interesting. He says, Di'im kol ha'ir, merutzav ba'avanim o ba'krashim, yesh lahakal bazeh. So what the Sharat Tzion seems to be describing over here is that, let's say you live in a place like a more urban area where the majority of spaces are, what do they call it, hardscape? Is that the term? Hardscape? Whatever. Paved, hard surface areas. So he writes, Yesh lahakil bazeh. There's no reason to be machmir like this, like the Magen Avraham. He says, Va'afilu im nachmir lekamon b'kibud, hacha kiltfei. Even though there are some, now remember the psak of the Shulchan Aruch was that you're not allowed to sweep, right? You're not allowed to sweep because what are we concerned about? We're concerned that even if you sweep a hard surface, what's going to happen? You may come to go ahead and sweep a non-hard surface. Then we saw the Bar Halacha who has this whole kula over there, which is how we conduct ourselves contemporarily. Sharat Tzion says, even those who are machmir by sweeping, listen to this, hacha kiltfei. This case is easier. Why is this case more? Watch this. Dafilu be'eno marutzaf. I will say, even if you have a situation, let's go through this for a second. Let's say you drag, right? You have a piece of patio furniture, and you drag it in your yard, and it's hard, it's heavy, and so it's a psik reisha case. It is definitely going to create a furrow. So the Chaburah says something like this. In reality, it's not such a halachic problem. I'll tell you why. I watched this. This is fascinating. Dafilu be'enu marutzav, les bazeh gzera grara do'oraisa mikama fani. He says it's not Issa D'Oraisa. I'm telling you why. Suppose now watch this. What the Sharat Tzion is telling us is, come on, let's be honest over here. Even if you took a heavy piece of furniture, which is definitely going to cause a furrow, and you drag that across your yard, it is not an Issa D'Oraisa. Why is it not Issa D'Oraisa? Watch this. He says for a couple of reasons. Number 1, Echad, Da'achar Chiaseh, Hu Bazeh, Rak Chofer Kila Achar Yad. Number 1, Abba saying, this is not an Issa D'Oraisa. Why is it not Issa D'Oraisa? Because remember again, it's true you're making a furrow. But how are you making that furrow? How are you making it? With a shinui. Kila achar means a shinui. I was about to say, this is not the way people make furrows. Right? People don't drag furniture to make furrows. So number 1, the whole act is an act of a shinui. I was about to say, remember again, we know in Hilchos Shabbos, once you do something with a shinui, what does that automatically do? What does it automatically do? It makes it a d'Rabbanan. I was about to say, that's off the bat. Right? That's off the bat. Once something is done in an unusual way, it's been relegated from the status of a d'oraisa to a d'Rabbanan. That's number 1. Number 2, va'od du mekalkel al yedei agumos shenasim abayis v'lo metaking. Further, I'm going to say again in general, this is what mekalkel. Why is it mekalkel? Mekalkel means what? It's a destructive act. If it's happening in your house, it's really destructive, right? And even in your yard, in your backyard, assuming that you're not a farmer and you're plowing a field, it's destroying the property. So number 1, it's a shinui, right? It's a shinui. It's kila achar yad. Number 2, it's mekalkel. Va'al kulam, get ready for this. Va'al kulam halo einu mechavin lozeh v'rak psik reisha delo nechale. Furthermore, again, I will say, it's a psik reisha, right? Delo nechale. Psik reisha de lo nechale means that while it is an act that is unavoidable, it is undesirable. So psik reisha de lo nechale means an act which results in an unavoidable malacha, but the unavoidable malacha is undesirable. I don't want it. I don't want it. So watch this. V'gam bazelu kuli amo hu rak isur dirabanan. And I will say psik reisha de lo nechale is also a dirabanan. Umevor le'el b'sim shintes zayin sif gimel ba'agav v'das aramosham muchach t'shrei ba'amo t'mutshei dirabanan muter psik reisha lo nechale. Okay, I will say, watch this. This is fascinating. The Sharat Zion introduces us to a fascinating kula. That when you have a psik reisha de lo nechale, which again, let's just define our terms. Psik reisha de lo nechale, how do we define it? An act which results in an unavoidable malacha, but not desirable. It's not just that I don't want it. The lo nechale means like I actively don't want it, like it's undesirable. So listen to this. So Sharat Zion writes, we have a psik reisha de lo nechale that is also a double dirabanan. It's mutter. So watch this. So therefore, I'm going to say, so what's the case of this? Watch this. So now, if you were dragging your heavy piece of patio furniture across your yard in a way that it's definitely going to cause a charetz. So I will say, let's go through this. Number one, the whole thing, as much as a psik reisha, what kind of psik reisha is it? What kind of psik reisha? The lo nechale. Furthermore, again, it's a trade dirabanan. There's two dirabanans about. Number one, it's kila achar yad. It's done b'shinui, right? It's not the wrong way to make a faro. And number two, ultimately, it's kilkul. It's destructive in nature. I'm destroying the land. It's destructive in nature. When you have a psik reisha de lo nechale accompanied by two drabanans, it's mutter. I'll say incredible. So therefore, again, it's fascinating. Therefore, the Sharat Zion pretty much disagrees with the Magen Avraham. The Sharat Zion says it would technically be mutter to go ahead and move the heavy piece of furniture across the yard. Now, I will say, now again, I want to point something out. That halacha l'maisa, you still wouldn't do it. In other words, that at the end of the day, if we're talking about moving a heavy piece of furniture across the backyard, you still wouldn't do it. Even though it's a psik reisha lo nechale with two drabanans. The point that the Sharat Zion is trying to make is on the Magen Avram's concept of moving heavy furniture in the house, right? So the Magen Avram wants to say, you can't move heavy furniture in the house because essentially any act that would be a psik reisha on karka, outside, right, or on a dirt floor, is going to be usher even on a hard surface. All the Sharat Zion is saying is, that can't be true. That can't be true. That is such a halachic stretch. Because if we're honest with ourselves, even the act of moving a heavy piece of furniture in your backyard should technically be mutter. Okay, we don't do it. Atu, whatever. We don't do it. But lamaisa, to extend that to moving heavy furniture in your house, the Sharat Zion says, I think, is an incorrect application. So I'll say, so the Sharat Zion introduced us this concept of a trade dirabanan, but psik reisha de lo nechale. Really, it's really the reverse, right? It's really, you have psik reisha de lo nechale, and there's two additional layers of dirabanans associated with it. Technically speaking, that makes it mutter. So what we have over here is as follows: can you move heavy furniture? That furniture, which is the type that if you were moving it outside, it would definitely be a psik reisha. Magen Avraham would say absolutely unequivocally no. Sharat Zion absolutely unequivocally yes. So I'll say, I'm sorry. Nechale means de lo nechale means it's you don't want it. Nechale means you do want it. De lo nechale you do not want it.
Even the Sharat Zion is only being made if you live in a place where the entire city has flooring on their houses. Really, it should have been put there even if it's
correct. He's adding on. He's saying certainly in a place where the majority of areas are hardscaped, right? The majority of homes are hardscaped. So again, that for sure. But he's pointing out that really me'ikar adin. This is not asr. Alachas kama v'kama when you keep adding on the additional layers to it. So let's take a look at number 7. Let's get some other applications of this. So by the way, I do think that the moving furniture in the house, am I the only person who runs into this issue on Shabbos? No one else runs into this? Right? This happens all the time, right? People come over on they're last minute company, you have to rearrange the table, move in a new table, move the table itself. Again, large pieces of furniture that would definitely make Chatzim. Magen Avraham says you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos. Pashanasa. I'm sorry?
We usually don't drag them. We would pick it up, or someone would help him pick it up.
Yeah, enachinami, correct. But I'm saying, like a table, you could see yourself pushing it. Take a look at number 7. Shmir Shabbos Hilchos, all right, says follows. He says, Mutter la'asiyah Agalas Yeladim b'Shabbos Yom. We'll say another case. Remember again, I will say just to kind of keep the context. We're talking over here of the din of koveshes, right? We established based on the Gemara number 2 and in Rashi and in number 2 that the concept ultimately again of choresh is the creation of a charetz, the creation of a furrow, which means the act of digging and displacing dirt, but an act which simply compresses dirt ultimately is not going to be a problem. So Shemir Shabbos Kochson number 7 writes as follows. He says, Mutter la'asiyah, agalas yiladim b'Shabbos Yom. You could push a carriage, a stroller, on Shabbos. He says, Lo rak b'kvish salul, not only just like on a regular road, ela gam b'derech chol, even on sand. Now, sand doesn't just have to mean sand. It means on dirt. On dirt. V'lo rak la'asiyah b'kav yashar, and not only just in a straight line. Kiem gamlaf nosel it stadim mutter. You want to do figure eights, like with the carriage, with the stroller, right? Not a problem. You could do that as well. In other words, say his point over here is that Allah Chalamais, you could push a stroller, even though it's clearly going to make an indentation into the. I will say, by the way, what's true with the stroller is true with the wheelchair, right? Again, you could push these things on dirt surfaces, even though they're clearly making an indentation. If you look in the footnote over here, he says in Sadik Tes, Shamati meveno Shabbos alman arbach shlita usvara seimo sharahari hurak docha es hachol. Let's study. Turn the page 2. Because what are you doing? You're only pushing the dirt to the sides. B'makom shekvar nechbash v'gam efshar shachol shu docha hukein afar tichuach v'lo shayach lezer mishum ripoy ara. Okay, see, Shlomo Zalman gets into other pieces over here. That Allah Lamaisa again, he says that it also might be sand, and by sand again, we'll discuss. We'll talk about sand in just a little bit. Soft sand. Afar tichuach means very loose. Yeah, which means sand. Essentially sand. He says v'lo shayach leser mishum ripoy ara. Skip a little bit. V'chevan. Here we go. V'chevan the psik reisha de lo nechale. Right, das ha'arach lahakas. So here it is again. You keep seeing this over and over and over. This psik reisha de lo nechale. Right? Remember again, even though I will say one can make the argument. Now, obviously, the stroller case is going to be different because the stroller case again is not a charetz. It's koveshes. So that to begin with is not the isser of charish. But in addition, but still, even from a charish perspective, it's psik reisha de lo nechale. He says mikom makom, but seiruf im zeh she'enu ela kila achar yad. The gam einu el mekalkel. You see this keep coming up over and over again. There's a lot of room to navigate in these cases. Because again, this case is not really a problem to begin with because it's compressing as opposed to making the charetz. But Lamaisi, even if it was a charetz, number one, ultimately it's a psik reisha de lo nechale. Number 2, it's kila achar yad, shinui. And number 3, it's derech kilkul. It's really destructive in nature. So incredible. All right, so we don't have to go on. Take a look at what I say number 8. So some other examples of choresh. So again, that stroller case is a very shaykh case. Remember, whatever is true for a stroller is going to ultimately, again, be true for a wheelchair as well. So one can push a stroller on Shabbos, one can push a wheelchair, even through dirt, even through mud, even though, again, it's clear that Allah Lamaisa, one is making a depression, one is imprinting on the earth. Lamaisa, that's called koveshes. It's not called choresh. Incredible. Look at number 8. Another example. So here, same hakdar from the Chaburah. Look at the underlying line. He says, "Oshahaya sham tal katan v'shpilo oshahaya sham makom namuch v'hishva osa." The other definition of choresh is the removal ultimately again of obstacles from the ground. The removal of obstacles. In other words, if you remember, choresh means the act of. We've already established, it doesn't just mean plowing, but it means what? Any act which ultimately readies the soil for planting, or readies the soil for plowing, right? So amongst that is removing obstacles from the ground. So for example, in number 9, the Eglei Tal brings down, he says, Rabbi, the act of removing dead plants. So let's say, for example, again, removing a living plant from the ground on Shabbos is a problem we're going to see because of kotzer. Right, there's a malacha of harvesting. The definition of harvesting is oke davar mimokum gidulo. You uproot something from the place where it grew. What happens if you have a dead plant? Plant is dead, right? Or weeds that are dead, and you just want to pull it out of the ground. So there's no kotzer. So again, that would still Eglei Tal brings down. That's the malacha of choresh. Sitting on we will see, leaving aside the muktzah considerations, removing stones from the field, from a ground, from karka, would also be choresh, because these would be classic acts that one would do to ready soil for plowing. In number 10, Shvisa Shabbos, for example, just do these outside, he says fertilizing a field is also choresh. Right? Because again, remember, when you fertilize the field, you're readying it to be planted, right? You're readying it to be plowed. That's also called choresh. Good. Take a look at number 11. Chaburah comments over. He says as follows. This is fascinating. He says, an exception, I mentioned this already, but I mentioned it outside, sand. There's no choresh when it comes to sand. Right? Now, why is that? Because it will say the whole chap of choresh is what? What's the chap of choresh? You make a furrow and it stays. So therefore, again, the act of making a hole in sand, ultimately, again, will not be choresh. Now, the truth is, the poskim bring now, what happens if you have wet sand? Right? So wet sand, technically speaking. So again, this could be a potential issue. So that's why, again, allowing kids to play in a sandbox on Shabbos, again, we're leaving aside the muktzah considerations right now. But from a choresh perspective, there's absolutely no, even though with the shovels and with everything, there's no charisha in that, there's no choresh in that, because Lamaisa, again, no furrow remains. Wet sand could potentially be an issue. Now, the truth is, the majority of poskim, well, it's not really an issue, based on last week's share, that we saw that the only time that something is subject to choresh is when ultimately, again, it is dirt that is capable of planting. But it may still be asr midrabanan if the sand itself is wet. But for our purposes right now, soft sand, dry sand, no problem of choresh. Shabbos, our last topic for tonight, just in the literally, and hopefully we'll be able to finish it, is also an interesting application of this, is the concept of removing mud from shoes. We're not going to finish this, but at least I'll start it tonight. We're already falling behind. All right. Suppose I take a look at number 12. It's a good part. We're on our own schedule. We're fine. Whatever it is, it is. So take a look at number 12. So let's at least begin this, and then we'll read the Shulchan Aruch, maybe stop for tonight. He says as follows: Tit sha'al raglo, o minallah. Suppose let's say a person has mud on his foot or on his shoe. Let's go with the case of a shoe, right? You step in the mud, and l'maisa, then your shoe is caked in mud. So obviously you want to scrape it off. So what's the halacha? Mekancho b'kosel avalo b'karka. You could scrape your shoe on a kosel, like on a wall, right? On a structure, but you can't scrape your shoe against the ground. Interesting halacha. Why not? Dilma asa lashviye gumos. Now this is actually very interesting, right? Because the reflexive reaction when you get something on your shoe is to rub it against the ground. Shulchan Aruch says you cannot do that on Shabbos. Why? It's logical. Why? Because the act of rubbing your foot against the ground, against the earth, has the ability to level out the earth. And of course, that would be halachically problematic. Now, others say you're not even allowed to wipe it against the wall of a structure. Haga, so we'll see why that is. So the Ramah says, and there are those who permit both of these things, that you could wipe it on the wall or you could wipe it on the ground. So I will say, so let me just show you one quick halacha. Look at number 13, af bakosel. So I will say, so now let's go with the first opinion. I understand why wiping it on the ground is going to be problematic, because the act of rubbing my foot against the ground really runs the risk of going ahead and leveling out the ground. But obviously rubbing it against the structure is fine. Like I rub my foot against the wall, it's not a big deal. Why would you say that rubbing it against the wall is problematic? Look at the Mishnah number 14. Af bakosel shalavonim mishum demechsi kimosif ala binyan umechasko. This is interesting. The act of rubbing mud against the wall has the appearance of what? Of adding to the building. Right? I'm adding mud to the building. And therefore, again, umachsiko l'didei ein mekanchen ela b'kora gabe even v'adin deshay b'kosel shleit. So we'll say, we'll see. So essentially, we have a fundamental machlokes, three machlokes. First opinion says that Allah might say you can wipe your foot on the wall, but not on the ground. Second opinion ultimately says you can't even wipe it on the wall. Third opinion says that you can wipe it on everything. We'll stop over here for tonight, I will say. But let me ask Hashem continue with this next week. Sure, all right, so maybe one more week. No, we're not even going to spend... Next week already, we're going to move into Zoreya. And Mirat Hashem will spend the first couple of moments finishing up Choreish. We'll say tremendous shkoyach. Amad Yomi, again, for those who want to join us, begins in 5 minutes in here. Really. Even this last thing was